today we'll be talking about mindfulness of body. And the practice of establishing an anchor is directing our attention from being up in our heads and dropping it back down in the body. And this begins to introduce us to what is the first foundation of mindfulness, which is mindfulness of the body. There are 4 foundations, and I'll cover each of them. Today I'm covering the first one. And in mindfulness of body, we're really just expanding on practicing with an anchor. The importance of this first foundation for our practice cannot be overstated, because as we begin to see in practicing with an anchor, we tend to live most of our life up in our head, not recognizing what is going on in our body. Everything we experience in life passes through this first layer of our body, this first foundation. And when we don't pay attention, we get caught in a mood without ever noticing the onset of the sensations in our body before our mood shifts. By the time we realize that we're thirsty or hungry, we're already slightly to significantly irritated, probably treating the people around us differently, maybe even being a little mean. And this is often to the people we say we care about. Just as a self-inquiry, I try to examine how much do I really care about these people if I'm not even willing to notice what's going on in my own body. And instead I take it out on them. And this is because we often exclude and ignore this first layer of our experience, which is our body. In the most extreme cases, we can become dissociated or have traumatic stress responses. There's a pretty popular book out called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's a book on trauma. It's a great book. The author wrote, "Long after a traumatic experience is over, it may be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger and mobilize disturbed brain circuits and secrete massive amounts of stress hormones. This precipitates unpleasant emotions, intense physical sensations, and impulsive and aggressive actions. Survivors of trauma often begin to fear that they are damaged to the core and beyond redemption." And I think the reality for many of us, if not all of us, is that we tend to identify with some of the hardest and most difficult or most unpleasant memories. And this can live on in our bodies, affecting our moods and our emotions and mental states, affecting the way that we think, and ultimately clouding how we experience life. So in this practice, I know I said that establishing an anchor is the first step, but establishing an anchor is really just like lifting the foot. And the first full stride is becoming mindful of our body. That's really like taking the first step. Like a strong and mature tree, all the sturdiness and strength of the tree comes from its roots and the base of the tree. So this is the first foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of the body, which is the focus for today. And we aren't taught very much about our bodies in the education system. We're not taught very much about our minds or our emotions, how to regulate them, how to be aware of mental states, even though we all have this innate capacity for well-being and being aware of our experience. I spoke a little bit about this in the last class about how this system that we live in profits off of our illnesses. So it's not properly incentivized to have you well in your mind and your body. It makes more money if your mind and body are not well. So it makes sense why we aren't really taught how to access these aspects of our being and find a sense of well-being in the midst of our life, in the midst of difficulty. I like to think of it sometimes by imagining our body is like a car or a vehicle, and we're never taught about the gauges in the vehicle, how to understand these gauges that the vehicle is reading out to us. Or if you take public transit, ride a bike, or walk most places, you can also just imagine someone trying to fly an airplane without any gauges whatsoever. Nothing telling us where we are, how we are doing, or when the system is malfunctioning or failing or needs something. So we can imagine if we were trying to get anywhere in a vehicle without any power steering, power brakes, imagine not knowing how empty your tank of gas was. You don't have a speedometer, so you can't tell how fast you're going. You don't know if your engine is overheating or not. Getting where we want to go would obviously be incredibly difficult if this was the case. And yet, this is how most of us live our life most of the time in relation to our bodies. The reality is we have plenty of gauges, but we just haven't been taught about them or taught how to understand them and integrate them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our gauges. Our body has 5 main gauges that we almost never recognize, notice, or pay attention to, even though they're right here all the time. And these can be traditionally understood as the 5 senses. And many times we take for granted the privilege and ability of having all of them. They are seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and bodily sensation or touch. And I say traditionally 5 because in the modern era, neuroscientists and the like have broken out our perceptual capacity into like many senses. And some of them are like equilibrioception, which is a big word. It just means our sense of balance. Proprioception, which is the sense of movement and the position of our body. We have intero and exteroception. These are our capacity to sense internally and externally. And there's a lot of others like the sense of time and things like this. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to lump all of that into bodily sensation, the 5th one. So we have seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling. And I'll just be lumping all of that into the touch category. So, but it can also definitely be interesting to play with just noticing these other aspects of our perception as well in our practice, just sensing our taking in our sense of balance, things like that can be really interesting to practice with and pay attention to. And in mindfulness of body, we are coming back to what we so often ignore and leave out of our experience. Because our attention gets focused on something and we exclude all these other parts of ourselves and often the experiences of others. And so we start in the body. The traditional image of mindful awareness is like a gatekeeper in an ancient city, keeping track of everyone who enters or leaves through the city gates. So the gatekeeper doesn't leave the post and go with the person going into the city. Neither do they leave and go with the person leaving the city. They just witness the people passing through the gate. And so each of our senses are like little gates that we can witness openly in this way. Again, it's a simple but crucially important practice for us because we so often don't recognize, for example, the raised stress levels that might be present in our body, which are actually harmful to us. Maybe we've been watching a movie before or a show and we get so lost in it that we don't even realize how tense we've become, how elevated our heart rate is, or maybe it moves us to the point of anger or tears. And though none of it is actually real, our body experiences it as though it is. Two neuroscientists wrote a book called Altered Traits, and they said that cortisol, which is our stress hormone, if raised chronically, they used a big word, deleterious. It just means harmful. If raised chronically, it has harmful impacts like an increased risk of dying from heart disease. So mindfulness can physically help us in this regard as well. And when we ignore our bodies, it's like I mentioned in the first class about the late Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh. He says that when someone or some situation sets fire to our house, we typically react by staying caught up with our attention on that person or the situation that set fire to the house and never going to actually put out the fire in our own house. So maybe you're familiar with the phrase coming to your senses. In mindfulness of body, this is the practice. We are literally coming back to our senses. Many times we treat a sensation in the body, the unpleasant ones in particular, as though they do not belong. Like a problem that is not welcome here. When the simple truth is, it already is here. And from the vantage point of awareness, it already belongs. It's like I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of the war that wages within us. We can learn to allow sensations to pass through us rather than wrestle with it in our mind as it passes through us. If we are rigid and pushing away what is already here, our experience will be much more difficult and much more strained. So we can learn to have a kind attention and a tender compassion towards the varying sensations that move through our body. And our willingness to witness with open awareness can be like a comforting or nurturing parent to the hurt or wounded child in us who throws a tantrum when they fall or hurt themselves or someone hurts them. And we can keep this practice simple, just like the boat that goes adrift. We just notice where our attention currently is, and we return it to our anchor. And with some time and practice, we can rest in awareness itself.